Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader and today we're reviewing The Avoidable War, written by Kevin Rudd in 2022. Kevin Rudd is a former Labour Prime Minister in Australia, and by the way he speaks Chinese, so he knows a lot about China. He's been a long-time diplomat in China since I believe at least the 80s. A few months ago he came out with this book where he's warning about the dangers of a catastrophic conflict between the US and Xi Jinping's China. In this book he describes America's point of view on this issue, but also China's point of view. He talks about the 10 concentric circles of Chinese policy, and his solution to this conflict is managed strategic competition. One of the first things Kevin Rudd starts to talk about is Thucydides Trap, which is about when you have a rising power, then you will have a conflict between that power and the current power. And most rising powers have ended in wars. But Kevin Rudd points out that war is likely but not guaranteed, so we could avoid it. That's why it's an avoidable war between China and the USA. In the next chapter he gives us a history of US-Chinese relations. So China's resentment towards America started with the Versailles Treaty, where China had expected to get territory that Germany had occupied, but that territory went instead to Japan. So since then China has been kind of resentful towards the USA. And then you have the Korean War, which was a war between China and the USA actually. And until the 70s, the USA recognized Taiwan as a legitimate China instead of the People's Republic, Communist China. Since the 70s, Sino-American relations have normalized, and there was hope in the 80s that China would become a liberal democracy. Instead, you have had an authoritarian state which has managed successfully to have a lot of economic development, and it was clear that China was not going to become a democracy with the Tiananmen Square incident. And China's economic development was also facilitated when it joined the World Trade Organization. But China has recently taken a more aggressive turn. Under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, they focused on Chinese economic development and not provoking the rest of the world in any conflict, so they were basically neutral in everything. But Xi Jinping has made it clear that China aims to be the #1 power now, and it has argued that America is in decline, it's our time. It is China's century. And the United States now believes that China will deceive the United States if it is in its national interest, and it has done so previously over certain things. And half of this book is focused on the 10 concentric circles of Xi's China. So the first one is that Xi is the center of power, so he will remain in power in all likelihood for another 10-20 years. And that before Xi you had the authoritarian paramount leaders of Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, who were in power for about 10 years, a dozen years. But now Xi Jinping has the ambition to be remembered as China's most important leader, hoping to surpass Deng Xiaoping and maybe even Mao Zedong. And he's gonna do this in a Marxist-Leninist framework with a dose of Chinese nationalism. Policy number 2 is securing national unity. So this is crushing the independence movements in Inner Mongolia, in Tibet, especially in Xinjiang. That is why the Chinese have thrown a bunch of Uyghur Muslims into concentration camps, which the USA in recent years has classified as a genocide. Xi Jinping is also wary about the large Christian minority now in China, as there are more Christians in China than Communist Party members. And of course, 2 years ago, they ended Hong Kong's autonomy, and they have a long-term goal of returning Taiwan to China. That is one of the main things that will determine Xi Jinping's success. If he can get Taiwan back to China, he will be remembered as the most important Chinese leader. Goal number 3 is to keep growing the Chinese economy. There is a tacit social contract between the Chinese government and people. Keep having economic growth, and we will put up with your authoritarianism. If that stops, then China could start collapsing. And Xi Jinping, as he's more socialist than previous Chinese paramount leaders, he has put an emphasis on reducing inequality, and he has been putting emphasis on state interventionism instead of letting the markets be free. And if he intervenes too much with the state, then the economy could collapse, and then you will no longer have that much growth. So then the main legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party would be removed. Goal number 4 is environmental sustainability. So one of the things that Chinese actually protest about is having a cleaner environment. So they don't like having bad air or having things that crush them because of lack of regulations. So China has a long-term focus now of being more environmentally friendly. So they're still building new coal mines, but they want to reach peak pollution in 2030, and they want to be carbon neutral by 2060. To deal with climate change, then you need international involvement. So you need the collaboration of the United States, India, and China. Goal number 5 is modernizing the military. So China has put an emphasis on the Navy instead of the Army now. They are also investing heavily in cyber, so they've been doing more and more cyber attacks against the West in recent years, which included revealing private information of a bunch of government employees in the United States. And they have also invested in their satellite system, which is known as Beidou. You have GPS around the world, but their version of GPS, Beidou, is being used by several countries in Southeast Asia now and around the world as a cheaper alternative. The next goal is managing China's neighborhood. So Russia has become more and more of a Chinese ally, and Russia is the more disruptive of the two, as we saw them attacking Ukraine. So China can show we're the calmer big brother of our bloc. China has tried to improve relations with India, but they have failed as they have a disputed border, and they've had some border clashes in recent years, so the relationship is not improving. China also has a conflict with Japan over the Senkaku Islands, which Japan nationalized a few years ago, and Japan is an American treaty ally, so China can't do anything about that. And although China does not like what North Korea is doing with their nukes, the North Korean nukes don't threaten China, they will threaten Chinese rivals. And in Southeast Asia, China has allied themselves now with Laos and Cambodia, and a key to avoiding China dominating Southeast Asia is to keep the American presence there. So in recent years, when Trump wasn't clear whether he respected his allies or not and whether he would back them in event of conflict, then China increased their influence in East Asia. The next goal is on maritime interests and on increasing China's presence in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And one of the mistakes China has made is not taking the Quad seriously. And the Quad is a semi-alliance system between Australia, the United States, Japan, and India. But a couple years ago, they realized the importance of Quads. So to discourage members from collaborating with each other, they have retaliated economically against Australia. So now Australia is clearly an American ally, especially through AUKUS. And the way to balance against China in these seas is to increase the importance of Quad. The next goal of China is the Belt and Road Initiative. And China has an interest in developing Central Asia because that would calm down the Islamic tensions there. And also you have Muslims in Xinjiang, so if Central Asia is Islamized, then you could have terrorists from Xinjiang working from Central Asia. And the main ally in South Asia of China is Pakistan. In the Middle East, China has been mostly neutral, so they've been working with the Gulf Council, they've been working with Israel, they've been working with Iran, but they clearly have a tilt towards Iran and Syria. And they have clearly contributed to preventing nuclear proliferation in Iran. But as the Middle East becomes more contentious, they're gonna have to start picking sides eventually. And the American response to the Belt and Road Initiative has been Biden's Build Back Better policy, which has a bunch of strings attached. So American development policy, strings, China's development policy, no strings attached. So Africa is of course going to pick China over the United States. Goal number 9 of China is increasing influence in Europe, Africa, Latin America, and the Arctic. They're not going to be able really to increase their influence too much in Europe, as the Europeans are worried about data protection, since when you have a company in China, the Chinese state has access to all the data you have. And Europe is even more worried than America over human rights violations in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. In Africa, most of it has turned towards China because of the economic development of the Belt and Road Initiative. So now you have a strong pro-China bloc in Africa who votes with it, usually in the UN. And China has given a bunch of sovereign credit to countries in South America, such as Argentina and Venezuela, and there's so much debt now that it is worrying. And China has been putting pressure on Central American countries to switch their recognition from Taiwan to China. They're doing this with economic development incentives, so less and less countries are recognizing Taiwan. And the final goal of China is remaking the world order. So in tech, China is a leader in 5G. The problem is you have the Chinese surveillance state behind that, so less cybersecurity, so a lot of countries are not comfortable with 5G, but they're kind of wishy-washy with it, so we'll see how it goes. And in the new Chinese world order, they're gonna favor development over human rights. So what has America's response been to this? Well, you had the trade war initiated by Trump, which went from 2018 to 2019. Especially since COVID, the United States no longer trusts China, as it tried to cover it up, and then it blamed the United States for it. But Trump, although he was very bellicose, he had high level of officials visiting Taiwan. He was kind of wishy-washy on his alliances, so China grew bolder in its foreign policy assertions. But now with the Biden administration, the United States is calming the rhetoric, but they're making it clear that the United States will back their allies in Asia and in Europe. And then there's a discussion of whether Xi Jinping will be re-elected as Paramount leader in November 2022. In all likelihood, yes, because Xi Jinping is the first leader since Mao of conducting purges, so there's no established strong opposition towards him. And his legitimacy has been based on this Marxist-Leninism and nationalism he backs. And he has had an emphasis of we're gonna retake Taiwan. But if he ever entered into conflict with Taiwan and fails, then he'll be ousted. And then Kevin Rudd presents 10 potential scenarios of the 2020s, which includes a lot of different types of war, and several of them are over Taiwan. And he presents a scenario where China wins, the United States win, you have nobody really wins. You could have a war in the East China Sea or the South China Sea. And if China started a war, they would do so in the strong belief that they would win. So the consequences of a war could be disastrous. Either it could lead to America collapsing as a superpower, or it could lead to China losing face and the collapse of the Communist Party in China. So there's an interest in both parties, according to Rudd, to avoid war. So we ask Kevin Rudd, what is the solution? He says, manage strategic competition, which basically means, okay, we're gonna put some red lines. So we're going to discourage Taiwan's independence movement, while China will stop screwing around with their naval presence near Taiwan. Then you could have another red line on cyber, so basically stopping this cyber warfare, as it could be very dangerous. And then there are some potentialities of collaboration between the United States and China, so on climate change, for example. And to stabilize the economies, they could also collaborate financially. So how would they compete? Well, they could compete economically, and they could compete ideologically. So America's model of liberal capitalist democracy, China's model of authoritarian development style. So that is Kevin Rudd's Avoidable War. So how would I rate The Avoidable War by Kevin Rudd? I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. It's a nuanced take on the Sino-American conflict. He points out a bunch of policies of China's aggressiveness, a bunch of policies that the United States has used which has antagonized China, and the United States has to have a focus on deterring China from screwing around with Taiwan, otherwise it loses its position as security guarantor around the world. And you can clearly see in this book that Kevin Rudd has a lot of knowledge about this, and his perspective is fairly neutral, so I would definitely recommend you to read The Avoidable War. It helps you really understand the geopolitical realities between the United States and China, and he goes into great detail of the strategic goals of Xi Jinping. So an 8 out of 10. Definitely read The Avoidable War by former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. And if you want to learn more about the South China Sea, then I would recommend you to check out my book review on Asia's Cauldron by Robert Kaplan. It's a great geopolitics book analyzing the different countries in the region, such as Taiwan and Malaysia, and it emphasizes the importance of America's role there. Anyways, I'm David Reader, and I will see you readers next time.